It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, the Honorable Gregory B. Jaczko, who was chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission from 2009 to 2012, and a commissioner from 2005 to 2009. Prior to that, he served as a congressional aide to Senator Harry Reid and then Congressman Ed Markey. Currently, Dr. Jaczko is a visiting lecturer at Princeton University and runs a clean energy development company. He authored Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator. Dr. Jaczko, welcome.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's an honor to talk to this group and to share my thoughts about nuclear power and climate change. I have some slides. There's a lot of information on these slides, and I promise I won't go through all the information, but as was said, the slides will be available if anybody wants to go through them in more detail. I think before we begin, since really the topic is nuclear power and U.S. climate goals, I think it's important to really set the table for what those are. And I think this is an important milestone that gets to really the crux of the issue, which is what role can and should nuclear power play. I just pulled a couple of key dates, but really the key date in my mind that I keep coming back to is 2035 for decarbonization in the electricity sector. That's certainly a stated goal of the Biden administration. It's also effectively the recent goal of the IPCC as was announced recently. So that gives you a sense of the kind of time frame we have to really deal with the electricity sector, which is right now where nuclear is primarily thought of as an asset. So because none of these electricity infrastructure assets are deployable in an instant, when we think about 2035 as a goal for decarbonization, that means we have to have infrastructure in place certainly by 2030 with meaningful large-scale deployment in order to be really an entity that can contribute meaningfully to that 2035 goal. So that's a little bit of the framework for the discussion that I'll present. There seems to be, we appear to be in a time in which there is a lot of interest around this topic. I pulled a bunch. I didn't give sources and citations for these, but these are all various headlines related to these issues of nuclear power and climate change. America's warming to nuclear power was about polling results. America's support for nuclear energy highest in a decade. You can read all the headlines here. What's interesting is that not all of these come from the same time period, and a lot of what we're seeing today reminds me very much of what happened about 10 to 12 years ago when I was at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So if you'll see here, in fact, everything on the left is from over a decade or more ago, and everything on the right is recent. So we had a movie in 2013, Pandora's Promise, which basically made the promise that nuclear was going to be a solution for climate change, and environmentalists needed to kind of come around on those issues. A similar movie came out about a decade later. And so, what I'll talk about today is in many ways what happened in that earlier time frame and where we are today, and what lessons, if any, that tells us about how I think this period will go going forward. So, I think it's important, again, to put in context, and these aren't my words. This was an opinion piece that was published in 2015 by a number of energy and climate experts, James Hansen among them, indicating what we need to do for nuclear to be an element of climate change. And this is globally. And one of the statements they made is that we're looking at a total requirement of 115 reactors per year to 2050. And again, this was in 2015. And in their statement that nuclear will make the difference between the world missing crucial climate targets or achieving them. So again, I think just to set the table and put this in context, in 2015, there were calls for hundreds of reactors to begin being built every year. Maybe you could give them some slack and say it's 2023. Well, if we look at how we're doing, we're nowhere close to 115 reactors a year. We've certainly never done that in the history of the industry. So it's certainly a monumental task for nuclear to be a major contributor in the climate fight. Perhaps there'll be a minor contributor, and I think that's something that certainly we could talk about a little bit more. But I think at the face of it, when we are talking about nuclear and climate change, there's a lot of challenges and difficulties with that as a solution. first and foremost is that we're simply not, nor have we ever built reactors at a scale that really could contribute meaningfully. And of course, if you look in the last decade or so, while we've built a handful of reactors or two handfuls of reactors every year, we've also had almost an equal number of reactors go offline. So the net increase has been on a handful every year. So obviously things would need to change. And that's a lot of, I think, what the focus is right now is how can we change the policy paradigm so that nuclear power can become a meaningful contributor. And what I want to talk about, and again, is going back to that idea that where we are today is where we were about 10 or 15 years ago, or even 20 years ago, where there was a tremendous effort and push to stimulate through policy new reactor construction because of the need to have nuclear power as part of a climate strategy. It wasn't as extreme of a need at the time as I think it is today, but it certainly was a significant discussion, certainly among nuclear proponents, about this idea of nuclear being a solution for climate change and wanting significant policy to overcome these historical hurdles for large-scale nuclear deployment, or at least certainly in the last 20 to 30 years. So what did we do? Well, one of the first efforts was something called Nuclear Power 2010, which was a Department of Energy effort to basically test out the licensing process with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because for much of the undertone for a lot of these issues is that regulations make it difficult to license reactors, to build reactors, and that's really what's been holding us back. So in 2002, the Department of Energy started this program, got significant funding to test out the NRC's licensing process. Now, I'll note that the original programmatic goals for that were to have orders from one or more nuclear power plants by 2005 and operation of new nuclear power plants by 2010. Obviously, those goals were missed. Although one could argue perhaps that orders were in the pipeline for new reactors, but they probably wouldn't come till a little bit later. But there certainly were no plants in operation by 2010. And I'll go through in detail a little bit more what was done there. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 was a significant stimulus for the industry, essentially addressed some of the main issues that the industry felt were challenges at the time. One was a risk insurance program to hedge against regulatory delays, a production tax credit for these new and advanced reactors that was limited to a certain number of reactors, but certainly was a significant incentive for those reactors that were initial designs that were intended to be built first. And then federal loan guarantees, which was also very significant because, of course, one of the challenges with large-scale reactor builds is the concerns about financing costs and long construction times. So loan guarantees were a way to help reduce borrowing costs through, and quite frankly, in some cases, even allow borrowing when there was a lot of skepticism about new reactors. And then in 2012 was the culmination of about 4 or 5 years of, or probably 3 years of effort on SMRs and a strong SMR small modular reactor support program to the tune of about $500 million over 5 years. And that was started in 2012. So just to give you a sense, and I'm not going to go through all of the details, I'll just skip to the bottom line. There were two key elements of the Nuclear Power 2010. And there are, I'll just say there are other federal programs, there's R&D programs, there's a number of things that have been done to support the industry. What I'm trying to focus on is those things which are really designed to get reactors built and operating. So one element of that was the Nuclear Power 2010 Early Site Permit Program, which was to support the process of using early site permits, which was an enhancement to the NRC's regulatory process to facilitate licensing of reactors. 3 early site permits were supported through that program. And 3 of those, they were all issued, licenses were issued, or early site permits were issued for all of those, generally in a reasonable time frame. No reactors were built at any of those sites. So it was largely, a test of the process, but it determined the process could work, but no reactors came out of it. So you can look at that as a success or a failure, I suppose, depending on what you think the ultimate goal was. But again, if we look back to 2012, the goal was actually to get reactors built by 2010. A key element of that program as well was the and Nuclear Power 2010 combined operating license support effort, which did wind up switching, if you will, to the the winning horse in the race, which was the Vogtle that became really the lead license for a new reactor design. That license was ultimately issued in 2012 when I was at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and I'll talk a little bit about where that program wound up. But ultimately, no more than one of those COLs ever turned into an actual construction at a reactor. And there were other designs that were considered and that were supported, but only the AP1000 design type ever made it into an actual license. Another program in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 was the NGNP program, which was designed to deploy a high temperature gas reactor, an advanced technology, which was effectively a high temperature gas reactor with significant federal support. There was federal requirements for the Department of Energy to support this program. Over $1 billion or more was actually spent on the program, and it was canceled in 2015 with no reactors built. So again, this is, these all look very similar to the kinds of things that are happening today, and the outcome ultimately was no reactors built. The SMR licensing also, again, was started a little bit later in this kind of wave, but again, started over 10 years ago. The idea was to support 2 small modular reactor designs going through the licensing process to demonstrate that they could do that. 2 awards were issued. One was to Empower, a BWXT joint venture with Bechtel. That program was terminated in 2017, and they never built any reactors. NuScale did continue. They went through this entire SMR licensing support program. However, they did not deploy any reactors and have yet to deploy reactors. And again, it's important to recognize what the goals of these programs were. This was intended for SMRs that could be deployed expeditiously, and in that time frame, expeditiously meant by 2022. And here we are in 2023, and no SMRs that were supported in that program have actually been deployed. So, I just want to say that, I won't go through these slides in detail, but a tremendous amount of work has been done, certainly on the licensing and regulatory side, to prepare for building reactors. Many early site permits were issued, which is a way to expedite the licensing process or segregate the licensing process so things could be done in advance to ultimately make it faster. A number of early site permits were issued, and the ones underlined happen to be the ones that were supported under New Start, the NP 2010 program. The one in bold is Vogtle, in which they actually have built a plant that is now operating. One of the reactors there is operating at full power. Others that were withdrawn or never completed. If you look at design approvals, which is another element of this process, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has approved many, many designs for reactors. And of those, only the AP1000 has actually been in construction. A number of designs were proposed and then never completed. And all of this is, some of those design certifications, with the exception of the last 3 on those issue design certifications, those happened, say, in a prior wave of this issue, of this period. But the last 3 were all in this time frame of between 2005 and 2012 or 13, let's say. So during this kind of first wave of efforts to stimulate reactor development. And as I said, almost no reactors have come out of that. Many, many licenses have also been issued. As you can see here, at least 7, 8 licenses have been issued for new reactors in this country. Only 2 of those have actually been built close to completion. So Vogtle Unit 3 did complete recently, and Unit 4 is on track, I guess sometime early this year or late next year to complete. But as you can see, a tremendous amount of effort went into proposing these reactors, and nothing really came out of it, which I think is an important lesson as we think about how we're going to use and try and use nuclear reactors as a climate mitigation strategy. There was a huge effort to try and do this 10, 15 years ago, and it led to almost nothing. So again, this is just a list of the COLs that have actually, so the licenses for reactors that have actually been issued. As you can see, a number of those had been terminated. VC Summer Units 2 and 3 were actually terminated after significant construction. The others were terminated before any real construction was done. But those are actual licensed plants that in principle one could build today if there were the interest and appetite, and there simply isn't to do it for cost reasons and other reasons. So that's just to sum up where that kind of first wave wound up. Oops, and I've gone way over my time here. The large reactor stimulus, which was intended when I was chairman of the NRC, we had 18 applications for 28 reactors. It was the culmination of this Nuclear Power 2010 program, the culmination of the Energy Policy Act incentives that were intended to drive this nuclear renaissance. And what came out of it was one reactor as of today that's in operation 6 to 7 years late, and a second reactor that will come online again 6 to 7 years late. And the cost estimates are more than double certainly what the initial estimates are or were. And more importantly, they have priced these reactors out of really being a viable generating source for any reason, whether it's to solve climate or any other energy, electricity need you might have. So you can look then to the SMRs, which were also started kind of in the middle of that first wave, and look to NuScale. The problem with NuScale is they still don't have a finalized design. It's now 2023. They had a design certified. That design, while it was certified with an asterisk, meaning that the design was approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but with a number of issues that would have to be resolved when they actually would get to the licensing of the facility. So it's a kind of a design approval with an asterisk. However, that design isn't even the design that NuScale is currently planning to deploy at a reactor site in Idaho. That reactor design is going back to review at the NRC. And as of now, they haven't even submitted a design that can actually be, in the technical jargon, docketed, which means that the NRC can accept it and begin reviewing it in a formal way. So this is kind of their second or third bite at the apple on a design, and they can't get that design docketed as of March of this year, when that design was supposed to be submitted in December of last year. And then docketing is usually a process. It takes a month or two. And then the NRC says, yep, it meets all our minimum requirements. We can now work on it. They can't docket the current application. So that doesn't bode well for a reactor being built in the next 5 to 10 years. I give you all that historical context to look at what we're seeing now. We've got significant new stimulus for new advanced reactors. So this is kind of this new wave of effort to try and build support for nuclear reactors. We have probably the most actionable is the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, which was started in 2020, which has upwards of billions of dollars in stimulus. And again, you have to look at the metrics and the guidelines for these programs. The first phase and the most actionable phase, which I'll focus on the most, was to award grants for 2 reactors that could deploy rapidly, meaning that could deploy and be operational in 5 to 7 years. So 2025 to 2027. So that's 2 to 4 years from now. And I'll just skip to where they are. Both of those reactors are in what's called pre-application with review for the NRC, which means that they don't have an application yet that the NRC can actually review. So based on historical trends, it's almost impossible for those reactors to be built in the next 4 years. They still have to actually finalize an application, submit that for review, actually get a license application then, and then actually build the plants. So it's unlikely that these plants will be online in 2025 or 2027. Perhaps they'll be online by 2030. So coming back to what does all of this mean? Well, our goal is if nuclear is going to play a significant, meaningful contribution in climate change, plants need to be able to deploy at scale in 2030 in order to contribute meaningfully by 2035. And right now, we're looking at best to see demonstration reactors that could be built by 2030. And certainly, it's unlikely that even if a demonstration reactor were to come online in 2030, that you'd then be able to turn around and deploy at scale, because there aren't really any other sites that are actively looking for reactors right now. There are very few sites that have applications in progress. So maybe you could have a handful of nuclear reactors in the next 10 years or so. That's not going to contribute meaningfully to climate change mitigation and abatement. And those are just simply, that's just the status of the industry. People may like it or not like it, but that's simply the way it is. And when I wrote an op-ed in 2019, the situation was largely similar, and that's where I came to the conclusion that nuclear was not going to be a meaningful contributor to climate abatement. It was simply going to be a distraction. And I think I'll